Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I don't know about you, but it has been a busy week on this end. But I have to tell you that when I looked at my calendar and saw who I was going to be speaking with today, I got very excited. Today, my guest is Karp. She is a pediatric clinical speech language pathologist, and we have worked together for years. Carol holds 2 master's degrees, one in education and one in communicative disorders. She has 2 teaching credentials and was an elementary school teacher and training teacher for LAUSD, which is the Los Angeles Unified School District. She does incredible work with children and adolescents, and I cannot wait for you to meet her, so let's begin.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, Carol. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited.
I'm excited too. And I think I was telling you before we came on that you are the first speech and language pathologist we have had on the podcast. And when I was thinking of who to invite to talk about language and speech, it had to be you, of course.
Thank you. I'm very flattered, and we've had a long-term relationship. We know each other really well. And as I told you, when I was preparing, I was just thinking about all the kids that we have worked with together and the differences that we've seen, because you would keep retesting them over the years. And it's been so fulfilling and wonderful. So thank you.
It really has. And it's been wonderful to see the change. And that's why I wanted to discuss, the work that you do, the impact it has on a child's life, because I've seen it. I've seen kids for the first time who've significantly struggled, and then I send them to you, and then something miraculous happens.
Thank you.
And so I want to dig into kind of the work that you do and the impact of that work. So let's start with, how do you work and why do you work that way? You are a speech and language pathologist. Let's start there.
Right. Well, I would say that one of the main tenets of how I work is that I really come from a strength-based model. And I'm very fortunate because when I was training in this field, I was awarded a fellowship at NPI, now the Samuel Institute. And the woman who trained me, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, Dr. Elizabeth T. Hester, with the first evaluation I did, she said to me, "Your job is to tell these parents what their kids can do, not what they can't do. They know what their kids can't do, or they wouldn't be bringing them to you." And I really believe I based my whole career on those wise words from Dr. Hester. I mean, I really do. And so I do come from a strength-based model. And I try to find out what the kid can do. But that also comes from working with a team, because many times when I'm doing language testing, there's not a lot of strengths. But if someone comes to you for a neuropsych evaluation, you can find all kinds of strengths in their performance IQ and other measures that you do. And those are the strengths that I use when I am working with children. So I really like a team approach, and I really believe in meeting children where they are, but it's also within the context of a relationship and building that strong relationship with that kid and finding out what they're interested in and what they like to talk about. Because many times if you find a subject that they're interested in, you'll get so much language from them. Now, they may have problems with morphology or syntax, word order, whatever. But if you've found that area where they're interested, you can lay on top of that what you are remediating, and you get really, really good results. And the other thing too is that I really try to get rid of the shame. because I think so many of these kids come in with shame, and I'll often ask them, if I'm teaching you and you don't learn, whose fault is that? And inevitably they say it's their fault. It's the child, it's their fault that they're not learning. And I say, hey, you've got that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's my fault. I'm the teacher, and it's my responsibility to teach you how you can learn. I said, and I will explain concepts to you or ideas to you as many times and as many different ways as you need them explained. But you have one responsibility, and that's to tell me when you don't understand, because I can't read your mind. That is one thing I can't do. And I think that takes some of the shame away, but it also helps with self-advocacy, because these kids have to learn to advocate for themselves.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. And I love that you touched on, and I think it's so important to touch on the shame, because it can be harmful for the child themselves, because it interferes with their ability to see themselves as learners. Mm-hmm. But then you also see the parent shame as well. And it seems like sometimes they take on the shame of the parent when a child is struggling. And so again, it takes us to the strength-based approach is so important, because you're identifying things in them that they do really well.
Yeah, no, it's true. I will never forget this one time with this one mom. And I knew the mom never told me the child had a diagnosis, but certainly I knew that the child did have a diagnosis when I started working with the child. And we were a few months into the work, and I was walking the child to the car, and I looked at the mom and I said, I really love working with her. We have such a good time. And the mom burst into tears. Mm. And she said to me, you mean you really like her? And I said, oh, of course I do. We have such a good time. And we're really working hard. And it was a few months later then that she said to me, she has a diagnosis. And I said, yeah, I know. I just smiled, but it was great.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, that speaks to the relationship that you have with that child, and then by extension, the parents and the family. Right. And I think that when kids feel validated and they feel, and I often say this, seen and heard, it really motivates them to want to work on the things that are harder for them.
Right. Because they can ask you. And if they can't ask you, or they can't say, I didn't understand that, then you really don't have a starting place.
Right. Right.
And so I think that's why that relationship is so important. And it's interesting because I was worried about the relationships and building relationships online, because it was new for me to work with people online. And one of the boys that I was working with, who was really had retrieval issues, but was a dancer. And I started to have him dance words for me. Oh, I would give him a list of words, mm-hmm. and then I would have him dance the words, and I had to guess which word it was. And I would be able to say, I could tell by the way you moved your hand that you weren't sure, by the look on your face. We read those nonverbal cues. And we were able to establish a relationship and really work from there on language. Because I had gone to his strength, which was movement and dance. It was not language.
Right. And then you're also incorporating that multimodal approach.
Exactly.
Right. So you're engaging the whole body and the whole system mm-hmm. while you're doing the work. So, oftentimes I see children who've had speech therapy when they are younger, and then later on, in the context of a neuropsychological assessment, I identify a language disorder and recommend language therapy. But for so many parents, there's confusion about speech versus language therapy. Right. And I would love for you to discuss the difference for families listening.
I think for so many people,
right?
In general, yes. Parents, but in general, people, when I tell people I'm a speech and language therapist, they'll say, well, what do? You work on sounds, you work on W's for R's. And I said, yeah, that's part of what I do, but that's not all of what I do. I would say that speech and language therapists are language experts. I think that's what makes us different from occupational therapists, educational therapists, physical therapists. We are language experts. But we start with speech sounds. So when you're talking about speech therapy, you're talking about how you use your mouth and how you use your articulators. Your articulators being your lips, your teeth, your tongue, how you move them to make sounds. You're not talking about the rules of the language or the content of the language. You're talking specifically about the sounds. So they're really two different evaluations that you're doing when you're evaluating speech and you're evaluating language. Now, many times I'll have people referred for a speech problem, like they don't have their S right or they don't make an S. And someone will say, we just really can't understand them. Well, if that's your only issue, that you're doing a TH for an S or you don't have an S, although it's the most commonly occurring sound in the English language, people are going to understand you. It's really that you've got both a speech problem and a language problem. And the language problem can be harder to detect. Well, if someone's not making an S, they're not going to mark plurals. They're going to say cat instead of cats. And so what you want to do then is look at receptive language. Do they understand what a plural is? And you do that by pointing tasks or by using objects. And then you can determine, this is both a speech and language problem because they don't understand plurals, but they also can't make the S sound. So you've got to work on both. But it's really important to tease those little ideas out when you're doing an evaluation. And I almost think of it like a weaving, that there's a thread that runs across that weaving. And if you can pull that thread, if it's morphology or, the smallest unit of sound that has meaning, you might see that in receptive language. You might see it in expressive language. You might see it in their discourse when they're speaking. So you need to work on that thread across all modalities.
Right, right. And that's wonderful for parents to know because, again, sometimes when I'm making the referral for language therapy, there's confusion because,
right.
Their speech is fine. Why would I need a speech and language pathologist? But there's a difference between the type of intervention that you would do for articulation issues versus a child who's having difficulty with grammar and syntax and other aspects of language, either expressive or receptive.
Right. And so when you do an evaluation, again, you looked at receptive language, you look at expressive language, you look at morphology, you look at syntax, you look at semantics, you look at pragmatics, you look at discourse, you look at everything. And the one thing I really wanted to also say that I think is important is that speech and language therapists are not the people who diagnose auditory processing problems.
That's important.
I think that's really, really important to know. That you need to go to an audiologist. And for a central auditory processing disorder, an audiologist is the one who makes that referral. And I also think it's really important in terms of referrals, people can always go to ASHA, which is our national organization, and they can call them and find people in their neighborhood who would be an audiologist, who would be a speech and language therapist, who would have their certificate of clinical competence. Because you want to make sure you're going to someone that has their C's. That's the gold standard in our profession. It takes extra training. It takes passing a national exam. It takes keeping up on units every year. So you really want to make sure that you go to someone that has their C's.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And, you talked about the language, expressive and receptive. You describe both. And for some people listening, they may not have heard those terms before. I'd love for you to kind of describe kind of what receptive language is and what that looks like in a child's daily life. And then we can do the same for expressive language. I think that would be really helpful for parents who might not even realize that this is
there's a difference, right?
Yeah.
Receptive language looks at your understanding. And so it looks at your understanding of language. And I think that one of the things that a speech pathologist, speech and language therapist does that's really different is we start with the sounds, then we go to the words, then we go to the sentences, then we go to discourse and paragraphs and discourse. So we're going to look at understanding at all those different levels. Do you understand one word? Do you have trouble understanding more than one word? What about when there are lots of words that are chunked together? And where do you fall down? And there's so many, you have to understand semantics. You have to understand words. You have to understand that words can have more than one meaning. You have to understand figurative language. You have to understand metaphors. You have to understand similes. There's so much to language understanding. And again, if you're having an evaluation, you want to make sure that all of those areas of language are looked at in terms of understanding. Because again, that tells you where to meet a child. If I am seeing someone that can't classify receptively, that can't classify objects receptively, then I know that that's where I have to start, is with that classification. And I might start with objects and having them classify things. I've had kids who didn't know the difference between a fruit and a vegetable.
Mm-hmm.
It was surprising to me at 8 that someone wouldn't know the difference, who eats fruits and vegetables, that they wouldn't know the difference between a fruit and a vegetable. So you really start with that understanding and move forward from there. Then you want to look at expressive language, or what they say. And are they having trouble with expressive language? Can they find words? Are they having word finding problems? Is it retrieval? You need to find out where the expressive language is breaking down, where the receptive language is breaking down, and then we put them in those little compartments of semantics or word finding or syntax or sequencing. So you might see that someone just generally has a sequencing problem. Like they might not be able to take cards that are 4-step cards that show a sequence like going down a slide. And they might not be able to put them in order. Or they might be able to put them in order, but they might not be able to tell you what the story that goes along with the order. But then when you're thinking, you also have to realize that reading is sequential too.
Mm-hmm.
And that is this going to go into their decoding and into their written language.
Right. And based on what you've described in terms of the receptive language, the understanding, the expressive language, the sequencing, the organization of the words, the putting together words to make sentences and then paragraphs, it seems that a child's facility with language influences so many aspects of their daily functioning.
I can't even tell you how much it influences friendship. It influences your time in school. It influences how you do in the classroom, but it also influences friendship, because many times kids that don't get figurative language really early on. It's really interesting because it's estimated that like 30% of the language that middle school teachers use is figurative. That's a really high amount. But I can even remember driving my son to school when he was like 3, and I said to him, "I can't find a place to park. I have to go around the block." And he looked at me and he said, "Block? There's a block room at school. What do you mean?"
Mm-hmm.
It didn't fit into his lexicon what the word block meant. And there are so many instances where that happens really early on. Kids don't get jokes. And all of those early jokes are based on double meanings. Like, why did the man throw the clock out the window? Because he wanted to watch time fly.
Right.
Things like that. The kids will not get them. So it's going to affect friendships. And I think in this day and age, or before the pandemic anyway, everything seemed to move so fast. So the kids couldn't keep up. And also not to be able, if somebody hurt your feelings, not to be able to say, "That hurt my feelings. That didn't make me feel good."
Mm-hmm. And that kind of speaks to your self-advocacy too, because you need to be able to express what it is that you need in order to get the help that you need.
Right. It's really, really important. You need to be able to joke with people. You need to be able to exclaim. You need to be able to ask questions. You need to be able to answer questions. I had this one child that I saw who every answer to a question, and he was already in like first grade, every answer to a question was either vanilla or groovy. And that's how he answered questions. He didn't know how to answer questions.
Right.
And so it was really affecting his social interaction. And after we worked together for a while, he said, I knew how to rhyme before I came to see you, but I didn't know how to communicate. And you taught me how to communicate. He said, do you remember what I used to say when people asked me questions? I said, yeah. He said, like vanilla? I mean, that's how I answered everything.
Aww.
He said, I didn't know what to say.
Right.
But you taught me to communicate. And his father even, said to me sometime later, I never thought I was going to be able to have a conversation with my child. And I can talk to my child now. We have conversations.
And that is such a gift.
Oh, everyone should have the gift of language.
Absolutely. And I think, before we started recording, you talked about what a blessing it has been to be in this profession. And I feel the same way about what I do. And it's because you get to have this impact on the lives of children and to see the transformation. And I've seen it based on the work that you do. Like when I said initially that, we've worked together on cases with kids who I've seen for an evaluation who've really struggled with expressive language, sometimes with both receptive and expressive language. And then I send them to you, and the transformation months later, a year later, 2 years later is so significant in terms of the way it impacts that child's life, in terms of being able to communicate, being able to express themselves, being able to use language to understand their own emotions and to put words to what it is that they're experiencing and feeling. And again, it's such a gift to be able to do that.
Well, I remember you once told me, you said, I shouldn't say this, but you said, you're the only person that I send someone to and their similarities go up.
Yes.
On the whisk.
Yeah, they do, because they're able to see the relationships between words and make those connections in a way that they haven't been able to before. And it's just amazing. I often have to check and recheck my scoring. Is it possible that they went from the 16th percentile to the 84th percentile in this area of language? But it can happen.
It can happen. But I also think it's also just, it's really being creative. Like, I was working on nuances with somebody, and nuances are really hard, because how do you differentiate between fabulous, great, good? And what we ended up doing was mixing paint. And so we went from yellow to red, and we made like a color grid together. And I said, see, you add a little bit of red to the yellow and it becomes a yellow orange. And then, but then once we went from yellow to red with mixing paint, she really understood what a nuance was and was able to put that into language. But I used a different modality. It was going with the strength. It wasn't. And then Karen, remember some of the kids, like where it's been really interesting, where their written language was better than their oral language.
Yes.
They had to work backwards.
Right. It is interesting. And
because not what you learn in school.
No, because, I think that speaks to the idea that you can have two kids with expressive language issues and they can look so different in terms of how that manifests. So you can have that child who has expressive language difficulties orally with oral language, but can write beautifully. And then you have the kid with expressive language where it impacts both oral and written language.
Right. But the thing is with that though, that's why a full evaluation is really nice, because you get a better idea of their fine motor and their motor memory. So if you see that they have real strength in the motor memory, you can use that channel instead of the auditory channel.
Right.
I mean, that to me was, I guess that to me was shocking, because it really was not what I learned in school. Right.
Absolutely. And it just shows you how complex kids can be. But again, having that information helps the work that you do.
Absolutely. I also really love working with educational therapists. I mean, that's one of, I have educational therapists that I work with pretty consistently. And I think you get a lot of bang for your buck. I mean, you get both modalities being worked on at once by experts in their fields. And the progress can be really, really amazing. So I find that really a lot of fun. Yeah.
And I've seen that with that collaborative approach where, again, a child has needed more than just language therapy. They've needed language therapy, but they also need the educational therapy piece because there's so much comorbidity with language disorders and reading disorders and disorders of written expression. And working on those two processes in tandem, it can really make a significant difference. And the trajectory of that improvement can be significant as well in terms of how quickly the children can learn to compensate and show improvement.
But because that's what you're talking about too, is when I work with kids, I may be working in an orthodox way in many ways, but you see the improvement in school.
And that's what you want.
Right.
That's what you want. That's what you want. What you've described in terms of a child's personal experience, I'm now able to communicate. That says it all, because that's what you want for that child to be able to experience. The parent who says, now I can communicate with my child. That is what you want, because you want children to be able to express themselves in a way that they're thinking, because oftentimes there are a lot of thoughts in that child's head and they can't get it out in the way that they intend. And that's incredibly frustrating.
Well, that's where I help is with that organization and output.
Yes.
The organization of their thoughts and being able to question them. So you mean such and such. Give them, in the beginning, may give them choices because they can't retrieve the words, but work forward to where they're retrieving the words. Or you start out by teaching circumlocutions, talking around what you want. Mm-hmm. And then getting to the specificity. And also in testing, you look at, do they have an easier time with semantics, which would be kind of the circumlocutions, or if you give them the beginning sound, are they stronger phonologically? And if you give them the beginning sound, they can find the word. So those kinds of kids who are, stronger with the sound can go through the alphabet in their head when they're trying to find a word. The other kids can give you an explanation of what the object is or what they're trying to say until they hit the bullseye of that specific word.
Right. And I can, when we speak, and we've spoken a lot over the years with the children that we've worked with, you really tailor the type of treatment you do to a specific child. So not every child who's coming to you with expressive language issues is going to be treated in the same way or get the same approach to their treatment plan. And that's what you want. And that's what you need, because every child is so different and they're so complex. And sometimes they come with language-based issues, but also attention problems on top of that. And you're going to have to do things differently for that child than you would for a child who has language-based issues, but doesn't struggle with attention or executive functioning. Right.
You have to do it. You have to really do things very differently. I guess that's what I know programs, but I don't use any programs. Mm-hmm. I mean, I use parts of programs depending upon if they fit the child. Mm-hmm. I've really not ever been sort of a program person. I mean, I can give you an example. It's really interesting about a young man who really had retrieval issues and had difficulty with writing. But when he would come to see me, he would love to talk about food. I mean, he could go on and on talking about food because their family were real foodies and they went to all kinds of restaurants. Mm-hmm. So what we did was we became restaurant reviewers. We picked four restaurants.
Right.
And we went to 2 Japanese restaurants and 2 Italian restaurants. And we had a week in between. And we wrote restaurant reviews. And, it would first start out with description, just like a narrative, what the restaurant looked like, what the host or hostess was like, how the waitress or waiter treated us, what the food tasted like, how we felt about the meal. But then what we did is we went on and we added adjectives to make the sentences longer. And then we added metaphors and similes. The food tasted like velvet in my mouth as it melted. I mean, so that the richness was really added to these reviews, but then always keeping in mind, how can you use this in school? Mm-hmm. How can you use this for your writing in school? But it started with what that child was interested in, where his strengths were, and we went from there.
That is so powerful, because I've seen, and educators know this, that when children are engaged and you connect the learning and the intervention to their interests, they're more motivated to participate in the intervention. Mm-hmm. And then they learn more.
They learn a whole lot more. And I guess one of the other areas that I have quite a bit of interest in is the production of the narrative, of a self-narrative. Because I think that that's really, really important. And if you look at like the early research on narratives, it'll talk about parents who ask who, when, where questions, as opposed to why and how questions, have children whose narratives aren't as complicated because they're merely repeating facts. It's rote language.
Right.
It's not thinking.
Right.
And there's been some longitudinal studies that have looked at early narratives, like in preschool, and then followed the kids' narratives through middle school. And they found that kids who produced more complex narratives in preschool had better reading comprehension in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really, really important. That's something that I spend a lot of time on. The other reason is that I feel that if the kids become aware of their own motivations and why they do things, it's much easier to feel empathy towards other people. And when you're reading a book, it's easier to figure out the character's intentions.
Right.
If you have an idea of what makes you rock and roll. I mean,
right. And that helps with that higher level understanding and comprehension when you're reading. Absolutely.
So that narrative development is really, really important. I can't stress that enough because that is something that I really do work on with each child. But talking about what they did in school, well, how'd you feel about that? What could you have done differently? If you had to sum up today, how would you sum up today? What were the high points?
Right.
Well, with the Obamas, what were the roses? What were the thorns? That kind of thing.
Right. And engaging in that discourse is so important because I think oftentimes parents will say, how was your day? And then a child will say, good, fine. So it sounds from what I'm hearing from you is that they need to probe more to further develop language because it's not only kids who are struggling with language that need continued support of the development of their language system. All kids need this support. And what you're saying is asking who, what, and when is not enough. We really need to ask why and how to further develop that language system.
Right, exactly. And like you said, for higher level thinking, look at these kids are going to be inheriting a world with lots of problems. And they need to have these thinking skills and they need to have this flexibility of thought. That's one of the things that I really always stress too is the flexibility of thought with synonyms, antonyms, homonyms. How many ways can you think about words? I think it's really important. Or classification skills really early. There's a really well-known task. It's a Piagetian task. It's classifying mommy and baby animals, farm animals, and mom and humans. And how many ways can you classify these? Well, you can classify them by mommies and babies, but you can also classify them by human animals and jungle animals or farmer animals. And you see if kids have that flexibility of thought. And presenting lots of activities like that where they can move categories when they're very young is really, really important. It's almost like it's almost like the Venn diagram that you use when you're older to write.
Right. And as I'm hearing you speak, I'm thinking about, the parents who might be listening, educators who might be listening. And what would you say are some things that parents and educators can do to facilitate the development of the language system so that young children are in elementary school will be ready for middle school, preschoolers will be ready for elementary school? What would you suggest to them would be important for them to do to help the development of those language systems?
Well, I think part of it's not talking too much as the parent.
Not doing all the talking.
Not giving too much language.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is really being a great listener and picking up on what your child says and asking questions about that to help move them forward. Especially with young kids, you see a lot of this. The parents talk too much, And this interpretation of feelings, you must be feeling blah, blah, instead of saying, so how are you feeling today? How did that make you feel? Oh, I can understand that. That happened to me once when a friend didn't want to play with me. I felt so sad. What did you do? Well, this is how I solved it. We had different ways, but it seemed to work for both of us. So I think that's really important, and certainly reading and story retell. I think with young kids, keeping a diary before they can write, doing it with pictures, and then moving forward from there, I think is really great. And from elementary to middle school, you want to make sure as a parent, I mean, this isn't something a parent does, but you want to make sure that they just have their basic skills and that you have an idea of strengths and weaknesses and what they enjoy. And not because you want them to be a ballet dancer, but because they want to draw, let them draw. Let them do what they're good at and motivate them to do more of that. You can bring movement in later, but do it in a way that's fun for them. I think they have to have fun with their kids and listen to them and kind of take their cues from them, because you can't make them different than they are.
Absolutely.
And kids feel that if you're trying to make them different than they are. I don't know if I answered that.
No, you did. And you did. You absolutely did. And as I'm thinking about what you just said, I feel like that's a whole other podcast episode that we could do about that. Because I think that really kids internalize what it is that their parents' expectations. And when that differs from what they want for themselves, that can create a lot of emotions.
Right. Find that jewel in your kid. Yesterday, I had the most interesting experience with a child that I was working with. The child was doing a report on an artist. And she said to me, I love this artist. When I see these pictures, she expresses things in her pictures. This artist expresses things in her pictures that go beyond words. They mean more to me than words mean to me. And I said, that's so fascinating. I said, let's look at a picture together. Let's look at one of the pictures that you really like. And let's figure out why you like it. Let's figure out why you like it with words. Mm-hmm. And so we went through and it was Escher. So it was all these crazy perspectives of things and people walking upside down. And we got so much language out of that picture. Mm-hmm. It was very fulfilling.
I can see why. And I could talk to you all day. Because I just love the work that you do. And I love the collaborations that we have had working with kids and seeing, again, the transformation and the change and the improvement over time and the joy that comes with really feeling confident in your ability to understand what people are saying and your ability to express yourself in a way that you intend. So thank you so much for coming on this podcast today. I think all the information that you shared will be helpful for so many people who may be seeing some language-based issues in their own children, who are maybe teaching a class and now are thinking of ways that they can engage children in a way that activates that language system. So again, I appreciate you in so many ways for all the work that you do. And I know that people are going to want to get in touch with you. And so I would love for you to share, what is the best way for people to reach you? Is it via email?
Either email or phone. Either one is fine. That would be great. The phone number is 310-804-7805. And the email is Carol W. Karp, K-A-R-P @gmail.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carol.
I can't thank you enough, Karen. I feel like you've given me so many opportunities throughout my career. So thank you so much. And thanks for being you and starting this wonderful organization.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I had so much fun speaking with Carol and reminiscing about the many families where we have collaborated and had great results. This was such a meaningful discussion, and I'm sure you can see why I enjoy working with her. Carol is one of the growing number of youth service providers in the Child Nexus professional community. That community is multidisciplinary. We have occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, neuropsychologists, educational therapists, child psychologists, educational attorneys, and schools for students who learn differently. If you are one of these passionate providers committed to providing high-level care to families, and you are interested in connecting with a fantastic network of allied professionals, reach out to me so I can learn more about you and you can learn more about Child Nexus. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.